The paper is Fighting Crime with Artificial Intelligence, combining AI and statistical modeling to enhance crime detection and digital evidence. It doesn't work as easy as it does on TV, right? No. This is Austin Lee Healy.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Austin Lee Healy, and this is my project, Fighting Crime with AI. Now, I'd like to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. I am as young as I look. But I say that only because I don't want it to distract from the merit of this research and the work that I've done. I've had the amazing opportunity to work with three huge collaborators, Access Data being the main one. Access Data is a software development company primarily focused on financial crimes. And through Access Data, I got to work with two huge forensics labs in Europe, and they really served as the ground of my research. The fundamental problem that we have here is there's too much data that investigators have to deal with and too little time to go through it. There's a bottleneck in the system in two places, and it's really holding up the whole system. We see this bottleneck in two places, processing data and reviewing data. Processing data is where investigators get all the available evidence and put it into a state where they can look at it. And this in the past has been the major problem, but reviewing data is a little more tricky because this is the part where the investigator has to manually go through and look for the smoking gun, if you will, find the evidence that will determine whether someone is innocent or guilty. And so there are only a few ways we can really solve this. The first is workflow techniques like job specialization, tasking. It makes it go by a lot faster. Automation, auto-scripting, tagging, categorizing document types and things makes it go by a little bit faster. But the real silver bullet here, and the topic of this research, is an AI program that aids the investigator in their jobs, and that's what this project is about. So my hypothesis was simple. If I create an AI and a tailored workflow that these investigators can follow, I can drastically increase the speeds at which these people are able to do their jobs. But really fast, I want to clarify what that means, because I often say this and I think, oh my gosh, you've made an AI that solves crime. That's brilliant. But that's not what I did. I want to get there, but that's not what I'm talking about here yet. Fiat Labs told me that in their workplace, they have effective investigators and they have less effective investigators. And the difference between the two is pretty drastic. And they told me, okay, if you can make an AI program and a workflow technique that forces a less effective investigator to work as productive as a more effective investigator, then I could drastically increase the speed of the entire process. And so that is what I tried to do today, and that's what I'm talking to you about. So looking at this from a bird's eye view, I really needed multiple AIs to solve this task, because what I was trying to do is model how a more effective investigator would do his job. And a more effective investigator would split up his job into a few subtasks. First, he would probably categorize the data into things that he would think are important to a case. And then he would go through those categories and find the critical data that would determine if the person is innocent or guilty. And so I really needed multiple AIs to handle these two different subtasks. So the different AIs that I had access to through Access Data were statistical, pattern, and neural networks. And now, I'm not an expert in AI, and I think, quite honestly, it's hard to be an expert in everything there is to know. But I'm going to explain it how I understand it so that if people in the audience don't have as much background, they can still keep up with the presentation. Statistical AIs are kind of like what they're the most basic AI, and they work kind of like how you would expect a computer to run. They look at the basic words, basic numbers, and they categorize the data based off of that. Pattern AIs are a little more sophisticated. They build a procedure by which they go through the entire data set and go down the lines of steps to categorize it based off of that. And neural networks are by far the most advanced, by far the most powerful. But for many reasons, they were not super beneficial to this project because neural networks take thousands upon thousands of trials to train. I only had 4 data sets to work with, and so I could not train an effective AI to go through that from what I was given. I did find a use for it in the end, but I'll get into that later. So the statistical analysis AI, I found it was very useful at doing the first half of the investigator's job, at categorizing the data. And what I had it do was essentially look at word groups in each document. Word groups I defined as 2 consecutive words, and then compare it to all the other word groups in other documents. The logic being, if a certain amount are the same, then they're probably talking about the same thing. We should put them into one category. And so there were a lot of trials I ran. This is not even half of the data, but I eventually simplified it down to 2 independent variables. The number of features or word groups I would look at through one document, and then the clustering threshold, or the percentage of similarity between 2 documents. So the number of features, intuitively, as you increase it, it would exponentially increase the processing time. Because if you add 1 leg in the comparison, it exponentially increases the number of comparisons that you need. But that wasn't exactly the case. If you look at the data, it does suggest that it increases exponentially. However, it increases by a factor relatively negligible, and going from 30 to 100 wasn't that big of a jump. And so I went with 100 features per document. Clustering threshold was a little more tricky because there were multiple things that changed. Processing time didn't really change very much, so that was fine. The number of clusters generated, I thought was going to get smaller as you go further down the line, but it didn't really change by a factor that was very significant. It would vary between 20 to 30 different categories, and it wasn't something that worth noting. But what did catch my eye was the fact that as you increase from 10% to 90% clustering threshold, the percentage of the actual data set that got clustered decreased by 90%. That's a huge amount. And so this was very significant. And to illustrate this a little bit better for you, if you start off with a data set of 1 million documents and you use a 90% clustering threshold, you end up with 3 precise document clusters, but a ton of the data goes uncategorized. And this, I decided, wasn't good for us because critical data could be in that file. If you only look at half of the data set, you're not doing your job. And so I eventually went with a 10% clustering threshold. Again, if this is 1 million documents, you still end up with 3 document categories, but now a lot less data goes uncategorized. But now if you can imagine me looking at my computer, now I kind of had a little bit of a problem because these document clusters are very vague. They would have thousands of documents in one category. That's not super useful to an investigator. And so now I needed a way to subdivide those categories and make them truly indicative of the entire data set. And this I accomplished with the neural network system. Now, again, I told you I didn't find a good use for it doing the entire task, but I was able to then simplify it down to processing language nature, or the mood, language type, document nature of each individual document. And this is really important because these documents, they're written by people, right? And people write in all sorts of different ways. And so it's very important to be able to categorize it based off of everything that varies between documents. And with this, I had solved the first task, again, to categorize the data. We start off with 1 million documents. We use my first statistical analysis AI to create wide, big categories. And then we go back through those categories with the neural network system and create precise and indicative clusters. From this is super critical because now what an investigator can do is look through one document out of each of the 500 document clusters and get an idea of the entire million document data set. From 1 million to 500 is a huge improvement. But that's only half the job, right? If you only look at 500 documents, you haven't done the whole thing. And so now I needed a way to utilize this information and go back into the entire million document data set and find all the critical data. And this I did with the pattern-based AI. And this is, again, the AI that creates a procedure and goes through every single document. But this was a little bit tricky, and and mainly because to create a good accuracy in the AI, or a good F-score, you really needed a procedure or decision tree that looks like this, because this is even and evenly evaluated on both sides. This is perfect. But in order to get something like that, you needed to, all the literature that I read up on told me I needed to evaluate 10% of the initial data set. 10% of 1 million is 100,000, and I can't give that to the investigator. And so now my problem was I had 500 documents to work with, and I was getting a tree like this. And this did not produce a good accuracy, and it was not thorough, because if you start it on the first leg and you lose half of the data in the first decision, it's not thorough at all. All the data here could be important, it's just not getting evaluated. And so now my problem became, how do I get a tree that looks like this to look like that? And I did this with what I call my pruning algorithm, or cluster and refine algorithm. And this was pretty simple. All I did was go back into the tree, find the nodes that were not already evaluated, and then reevaluate them so that the tree turns out a little more even and we get a good shape. And I ran all sorts of trials to try to find a good, accurate method to do this. But this was me randomly picking documents. It didn't produce a high F-score. The shape was all over the place. It was not accurate at all. This was searching for specific documents to be part of the seed set. The F-score was a little higher because obviously you're hand choosing the documents. But the shape was still very exclusive and it was not thorough throughout the entire data set. And finally, this is my algorithm, the cluster and refined algorithm, that produced both a high F-score and a high shape ratio. This allowed for the tree to look less like this and a little bit more even so that all the data gets thoroughly evaluated. And with this, I basically, I had solved my task. I had done both of the subtasks that an investigator would have done. But to get to this point, obviously, I had to whiteboard a ton of them. I'm going to go a little fast here because I think I'm running out of time. Pseudocoded over 10, I tested 4, and I eventually refined 1 utilizing the 2 key breakthroughs that I mentioned before. This was my first AI. Again, as I said, it utilized one neural network system which didn't really work because I couldn't train it. This is my second one because I thought I could accurately train it with an investigative feedback loop that also didn't work. I needed thousands of trials. This utilized my first breakthrough utilizing the neural network enhanced clustering. And I said it passed, but I wanted to get it a little more accurate because the F-score wasn't where an investigator could be happy with it. And finally, this was my final algorithm. And to go over it again, just in case people came into the room, we start off with 1 million documents. We used the first statistical analysis algorithm to make wide categories. We used the neural network system to go back into those categories and subdivide them into indicative document clusters. We have an investigative feedback loop to create a good decision tree that was thorough and evaluated the entire data set. And then finally, once we have a procedure that we are happy with, we go back through the entire data set and find all the critical pieces of data. This was the data on the my last final algorithm. As you can see, accuracy was very nice. The shape of the tree was also very thorough. But something I want to point out, recall I defined as every document set has some critical pieces of data in it. And how good was my algorithm at producing those documents for the investigator? And it was pretty good. I was very happy with how it turned out. I thought these results were phenomenal, and I said it passed on all fronts. So in conclusion, I believe that I validated my hypothesis. I think with this technology, we can drastically increase the speeds at which we're able to review this type of data. And something I'm pretty excited about is Access Data is now pursuing patent ideas for these two breakthroughs. Again, though, at the beginning I said this is not where I want to be. I want to make an AI that solves crime because that sounds really great. But that's not where we are. We are aggressively pursuing the technology to be able to do this. And I'm going to continue my research in the future. Thank you.